I, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, do become your liege man of life and limb. Westminster Abbey, June the 2nd, 1953. Elizabeth is already wearing the crown, and now her husband walks toward her. Philip approaches the throne, lowers himself before the woman he married less than 6 years earlier, places his hands between hers, and swears his loyalty to his sovereign. His wife, his queen. There's nothing unusual about homage inside a coronation. What makes this moment extraordinary isn't that Philip kneels. It's what he had already lost before he reached his knees. Less than 2 years earlier, this same man had been standing on the deck of HMS Magpie as a lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy. He was responsible for his own ship and every man serving aboard her. That wasn't ceremonial. Philip had spent years building that career. He'd served through a world war. He'd been mentioned in despatches for bravery. He'd risen through the Navy on professional assessments that called him an officer of unusual promise. And in September 1950, the Navy gave him the thing ambitious officers work their entire careers toward: command. Then his life changed direction. By the time Philip knelt inside Westminster Abbey, he'd already been driven out of the country of his birth as a baby. He'd given up his Greek and Danish royal status. He'd become a British subject. He'd taken the name Mountbatten. He'd married Princess Elizabeth. He'd built a young family while serving at sea. Then George VI died. Elizabeth became queen. And the future Philip had been building for himself could no longer exist. But this story is more complicated than the line most people know, that Prince Philip simply gave everything up for the woman he loved. Because what did he actually surrender? What disappeared from his life? And what was exaggerated later? What happened to the Mountbatten name once Elizabeth became sovereign, and once his wife wore the crown? What could the husband of a reigning queen actually do? There was no automatic power waiting for him, no shared crown, no constitutional authority simply because he was married to the monarch. We're going to follow the Royal Navy's own historical record, the London Gazette, royal declarations, royal household and royal collection records, and the authenticated words of Philip and Elizabeth themselves. Philip rarely explained the personal cost in public, so the documents will have to speak where he chose silence. His career tells us what disappeared. What he built afterward tells us perhaps even more. But to understand why that moment in Westminster Abbey mattered so much, we have to go back to the first time Philip lost a country, before he was old enough to remember it. Royal birth usually suggests permanence, a house, a country, a family name that everyone recognizes. Philip had the title from the beginning. The permanence was another matter. He was born on the 10th of June 1921 at Mon Repos, the Greek royal family's summer villa on the island of Corfu. His name was Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. He was the youngest child and only son of Prince Andrew of Greece and Princess Alice of Battenberg. His father was the younger brother of King Constantine I. On paper, Philip had been born directly into European royalty, but the Greece he was born into was already falling apart. In 1922, Constantine was forced to abdicate. Philip's father, Prince Andrew, was caught in the consequences. He was court-martialed, imprisoned, eventually pardoned, but on one condition: he had to leave Greece for good. The royal household describes the condition plainly: perpetual banishment. So before Philip could form any memory of being a Greek prince, the title had already stopped meaning what most people would expect. There was no secure palace waiting, no settled childhood inside the country whose name sat in his title. In December 1922, when Philip was just 18 months old, help came from Britain. King George V ordered a Royal Navy ship to evacuate Andrew and his family from Corfu. The vessel was HMS Calypso, and there's one detail in the official royal household account that makes the whole scene land differently than you'd expect. Philip was carried aboard in a cot made from an orange box. Not a ceremonial cradle, an orange box. A prince with Greece and Denmark in his title, leaving his birthplace in a makeshift cot on the deck of a British warship. The facts are strong enough on their own. What matters is what happened next. The family didn't return to an established royal home somewhere else. They settled in France, first around the Bois de Boulogne, then in the St. Cloud district of Paris. Philip would spend years there. That's the first thing worth keeping in mind about him. He was unquestionably royal. But his childhood wasn't built around the kind of stability the word prince suggests. Countries changed. Homes changed. The adults around him had their own upheavals, and Philip's education would soon begin crossing borders as well. There's also an odd symmetry here that nobody needs to manufacture. Before Philip ever wore a naval uniform, before Dartmouth, before wartime service, before he ever commanded a ship of his own, the Royal Navy had already entered his life. Not as a career, as an escape route. It carried an 18-month-old prince away from the country where he'd been born. 17 years later, it would give him something far more valuable than another title. France came first. Philip began his schooling there, while his family lived outside Paris. Then in 1928, another move. He was sent across the Channel to Cheam Preparatory School in Surrey. At 12, he left Cheam and spent a year at Salem School in southern Germany. And this particular school matters because of one man, Kurt Hahn. Hahn wasn't interested in whether pupils could memorize lessons and pass examinations. His educational philosophy put weight on responsibility, physical effort, service, teamwork, and the idea that young people develop character by being expected to do hard things for themselves. Remember the name Kurt Hahn. It's going to matter much later in this story. The political situation in Germany was changing fast. Hahn spoke publicly against the Nazis and was arrested. He eventually left Germany for Britain, where he established a new school on the Moray coast of Scotland. Gordonstown. Philip followed. And Gordonstown in those early years was nothing like the large institution people later came to know. When Philip began there, the royal household records that there were only 21 boys. 21. The school expected far more than classroom work. There was sport, physical training, responsibility, outdoor activity, sailing. Philip took part in expeditions around the Scottish coast and as far as Norway. He became captain of both hockey and cricket. Eventually, he became head of school. By the time Philip reached the end of his school years, leadership wasn't just a word attached to his birth. He'd held responsibility among his peers. He'd competed for positions. He'd been expected to contribute. And his final years were spent in an environment created by a man who believed status mattered far less than what someone could actually do when responsibility was placed in front of them. That distinction becomes critical with Philip, because there were plenty of titles available to him by birth. What he didn't have was a profession. Then, at 17, he chose one. In 1939, Philip entered Britannia Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. And for perhaps the first time in his life, the next step wasn't determined by which royal family he belonged to, which country his relatives had left, or which house was prepared to take him in. There were standards now: training, examinations, seamanship, navigation. A chain of command in which being a prince didn't steer the ship for you. Philip arrived at Dartmouth at 17. The Royal Navy calls Britannia Royal Naval College the traditional home of its officer corps, and Philip wasn't entering as an honorary royal visitor. He was there to train. Until then, so much of Philip's identity had come from circumstances he hadn't chosen. He hadn't chosen to be born Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. He hadn't chosen the political collapse that sent his family out of Greece. He hadn't chosen to spend parts of his childhood crossing from one country to another. At Dartmouth, there was something he could earn, and he did more than get through it. He passed out from Dartmouth at the beginning of 1940, after 8 months of training. He left with the King's Dirk. He also received the Eardley Howard Crockett Prize as the best cadet of his entry. That detail changes the way this entire story should be told, because if Philip had simply spent a little time in uniform before marrying a future queen, losing the Navy would carry one meaning. But that isn't what the service record shows. He was good at it, and the evidence gets stronger once he reached ships. Philip's first appointment as a midshipman was to the battleship HMS Ramillies in the Indian Ocean, escorting troop movements from Australia toward Egypt. He later served aboard HMS Kent and HMS Shropshire in the Asia-Pacific region before being posted to HMS Valiant in the Mediterranean at the end of 1940. The professional reports are even more revealing than the postings themselves. Contemporary assessments from Philip's commanding officers praised his practical seamanship, intellect, judgment, character, and enthusiasm. One description called him an officer of unusual promise. Another prediction was even more direct. He would make his mark in the service. Those weren't assessments written decades later after Philip had become one of the most famous men in the world. They belonged to the professional record of a young naval officer being judged on his merits. The Royal Navy wasn't merely somewhere Philip waited while his royal future took shape. It was giving him a future of his own. And there's a subtle but important difference between royal hierarchy and naval hierarchy. A royal title arrives at birth. A naval appointment doesn't work that way. A ship's company needs officers who know what they're doing. A commanding officer assessing a junior doesn't care whether his ancestry looks impressive in a family tree. He's deciding whether this man can be trusted with responsibility. Philip was trusted, and the timing couldn't have been more serious. Philip passed out from Dartmouth in early 1940. Europe was already at war. Britain had declared war on Germany the previous September. There was no long peacetime interval to learn his profession before it was tested. Within a year, Philip would be serving aboard a battleship in the Mediterranean. The lessons would no longer be exercises. The darkness outside the ship would contain an enemy fleet. March 1941. The Mediterranean at night. Philip was serving aboard HMS Valiant during the Battle of Cape Matapan, the major British naval engagement against the Italian fleet off the coast of Greece. His job during the night engagement wasn't glamorous in the way war stories are sometimes polished afterward. It was technical, and it mattered. Philip was responsible for controlling Valiant's searchlights. Think about the physical problem for a moment. A battle at sea in total darkness. Enemy ships that have to be found, identified, and held in illumination long enough for British guns to engage them. The searchlight team couldn't throw light into the night and hope for the best. The beam had to be controlled and kept exactly where the gunnery crews needed it. Philip did that job well enough that the official record followed him for the rest of his career. He was mentioned in dispatches for bravery and enterprise. His commanding officer, Captain Charles Morgan, later credited the successful and sustained illumination with materially helping the British gun action. Philip didn't win Cape Matapan by himself. He wasn't commanding the fleet. He was a young officer carrying out a specific task inside a much larger operation, but he carried it out under combat conditions, and his superior thought the performance deserved to be recorded. Buckingham Palace's own records also note that Philip was later awarded the Greek War Cross of Valor. And then the war kept moving, and so did Philip. At the beginning of 1942, he joined the destroyer HMS Wallace. That year was spent escorting coastal convoys off Britain's east coast. Then Wallace was sent back toward the Mediterranean for the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. The ship helped cover Canadian landings and took damage during air raids. Philip's wartime experience wasn't one famous night followed by safety. It moved between theaters, between battleships and destroyers, between convoy work and invasion support, and responsibility continued to increase. His next appointment took him aboard the newly built destroyer HMS Whelp as first lieutenant, second in command. The boy who'd once been carried onto HMS Calypso in an orange box cot was now the second in command of a Royal Navy destroyer heading toward the Far East. Not because anyone had found a ceremonial position for a displaced European prince, because he'd advanced through the service. Whelp joined operations connected with the final phase of the war against Japan. Then came September 1945, Tokyo Bay. Philip was aboard Whelp when Japan formally surrendered, bringing the Second World War to its official close. Philip's wartime record was unusually broad: the Indian Ocean, the Asia-Pacific region, the Mediterranean, British coastal waters, Sicily, the Far East, and he was physically present at Tokyo Bay at the end. When Whelp returned to Britain in January 1946, Philip came back not as the schoolboy who'd entered Dartmouth, but as an officer who'd spent years doing the work he'd trained for. And his naval career wasn't finished. Far from it. There was still room to rise. That point matters enormously, because another part of Philip's life was moving forward at exactly the same time. During the war, while ships carried him across oceans, his contact with one young woman back home continued. Princess Elizabeth. The story of Elizabeth and Philip is often made to begin at Dartmouth in 1939. The official record is slightly more precise. They'd already met. In 1934, both were present at the wedding of Philip's cousin Princess Marina of Greece to Prince George, Duke of Kent. Elizabeth was still a child. 5 years later they met again, at a place that already meant a great deal to Philip. Britannia Royal Naval College, Dartmouth. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were visiting with their daughters, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. Philip was in naval training there, and the Royal Navy preserves one wonderful detail about why Philip ended up spending time with the two princesses. There was an outbreak of chickenpox and mumps at the college. The princesses needed to be kept away from possible infection, so Philip was excused from part of his training and given the task of accompanying them. At one point that included a game of croquet in the captain's garden. It's a much more human scene than the version later legend sometimes produces. No orchestral music, no grand announcement that a royal romance had begun, a naval cadet, two princesses, a college trying to keep them away from chickenpox and mumps, and a game of croquet. What the official royal family record confirms is that they remained in contact, and they continued that contact throughout the war while Philip served overseas, including his service in the Far East. Their relationship developed across a remarkable divide. Elizabeth's war was largely lived inside Britain, where she was the elder daughter of the king and increasingly conscious of the public responsibilities waiting for her. Philip's war was lived aboard ships, the Mediterranean, convoys, destroyers, the Pacific. Letters had to cross that distance, and when the fighting ended, Philip didn't come back looking for a profession. He already had one. That's important, because it's very easy, knowing the end of the story, to look at young Philip only as the future husband of Queen Elizabeth II. But in 1945 and 46, Elizabeth wasn't queen. Philip wasn't a consort. There were still two separate lives being built, one inside the royal family, one inside the Royal Navy. After Welp returned to Britain, Philip spent the next period serving ashore. He helped train new sailors and petty officers and pursued further study at the Naval Staff College in Greenwich. The relationship with Elizabeth was moving forward alongside that work. Then on the 9th of July 1947, Buckingham Palace publicly announced their engagement. Philip was 26, Elizabeth was 21. To people watching from outside, it was a royal engagement. Inside the story we're following, something more complicated was about to happen. Philip wasn't simply preparing for a wedding. His official identity was about to be rebuilt. And this is where later retellings get muddled, because several different changes are often compressed into one dramatic claim that Philip had his name taken away. That's not accurate enough. The sequence matters. Before the wedding, Philip became a naturalized British subject. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal status. He adopted Mountbatten as his family name. Only later, after Elizabeth became queen, would an entirely different argument emerge over whether Mountbatten would become the name of the royal house. Those are separate events. And we're going to keep them separate, because in July 1947, nobody was announcing the engagement of a queen and her consort. The official announcement concerned Princess Elizabeth and Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten. George VI was still king. Philip was still serving in the Navy. There was still a believable future in which marriage and naval service might exist side by side, and for a short period, that's exactly what happened. In February 1947, as his marriage to Princess Elizabeth moved closer, Philip took the oath of allegiance that accompanied his new status in Britain. The Gazette records this among the formal steps by which Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark became Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, and that last name matters. Mountbatten wasn't something Buckingham Palace invented for him. Philip's mother was Princess Alice of Battenberg. His maternal grandfather, Prince Louis of Battenberg, had settled in Britain and during the First World War adopted the anglicized surname Mountbatten. Philip now took that family name for himself. So if we're going to talk about what Philip gave up, the sequence has to be right. He'd been born Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. Before marrying Elizabeth, he stopped using that Greek and Danish royal identity, became a naturalized British subject, and took his mother's family name in its British form, Mountbatten. That's a significant change, but it isn't the same thing as Elizabeth ordering him to abandon his identity. And it isn't evidence that the British government simply stripped a foreign prince of everything he possessed. The surviving official record shows something more interesting. A man preparing to marry the heir presumptive to the British throne was also reorganizing the legal and dynastic framework of his own life. The distinction becomes even clearer at the end of July. On the 31st of July 1947, George VI met with his Privy Council and formally approved the contract of matrimony between his daughter and Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten. The Gazette preserves that step too. There's something almost revealing about the dryness of that language. Contract of matrimony. No romance in the wording at all, because however personal their decision to marry had been, marriage to the king's elder daughter wasn't solely a private arrangement. There were constitutional rules, formal permissions, documents, a monarch who was also the bride's father, and Philip was crossing from one official identity into another. That's why the familiar line that he simply gave up his name for Elizabeth doesn't quite survive contact with the paperwork. He did give things up. His Greek and Danish royal status was part of that change. He did adopt a new family name, But Mountbatten wasn't taken from him in 1947. Quite the opposite. 1947 was the year he adopted it. That distinction is going to matter enormously later. One of the most famous disputes of Philip's life concerned exactly that name. But it didn't happen now. It came 5 years later, after the death of George VI, when Elizabeth wasn't just Philip's wife anymore. She was sovereign. Mountbatten was the name Philip carried toward marriage. 5 years later, even that name would run into the institution he had married. The wedding was one day away when Philip's official identity changed again. George VI granted him the style of Royal Highness. He made him Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich. Philip was also appointed a Knight of the Garter. The Gazette records those honors around the wedding, while the royal household confirms the peerage titles, the Royal Highness styling, and the Garter appointment. Then, on the 20th of November 1947, Princess Elizabeth and Philip were married in Westminster Abbey. Britain was still living with the consequences of war. Rationing hadn't vanished because there was a royal wedding. The royal household records that Elizabeth collected clodin coupons for her wedding dress, just as other young brides were doing in those years. That small detail keeps the scene where it belongs. This wasn't yet the Britain of a long Elizabethan reign looking backward. George VI was still king. Elizabeth was still Princess Elizabeth. Philip had just become Duke of Edinburgh. And after the wedding, something happened that's easy to overlook, because we know what came later. Philip kept working. He didn't leave Westminster Abbey and immediately disappear into a permanent life of palace ceremonies. He remained a serving naval officer. That fact changes the meaning of almost everything that follows. For the first years of the marriage, there was still room for two professional identities under the same roof. Elizabeth had the responsibilities that came with being the king's elder daughter and heir presumptive. Philip had royal duties too, but he also had the navy. The royal household describes these early years as comparatively private. Elizabeth cared for their growing family, while Philip continued pursuing his naval career. Their first child, Charles, was born in 1948, and followed in 1950. Philip wasn't choosing between family life and naval life in some single dramatic moment. For several years, the two existed together. After returning from wartime service, Philip spent 3.5 years in shore appointments. He helped train new sailors and petty officers and studied at the Naval Staff College at Greenwich. His marriage took place right in the middle of that period. Then the Navy sent him back to sea. October 1949. Philip joined HMS Checkers in the Mediterranean as first lieutenant, second in command. The Duke of Edinburgh wasn't being placed on a ship for photographs. First lieutenant was a working position. Second in command meant responsibility for the operation and discipline of a ship beneath its captain. And there was a contrast here that must have felt striking to anyone watching the young couple. In Britain, Philip was His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, Knight of the Garter, son-in-law of the king, father to a future king. But on a working naval ship there was still a chain of command above him. He still had a professional position to fulfill, orders to follow, standards to meet. A promotion structure that didn't depend solely on being married to Elizabeth. Uniform came before court dress on many working days. Naval timetables mattered alongside palace calendars. The royal family had absorbed Philip into its formal structure without yet swallowing his profession. His relationship with George VI took on new official forms as well. In 1948, Philip became one of the king's personal aides-de-camp, and by December 1951, he would enter the Privy Council. But those royal appointments came alongside his naval work. Not immediately instead of it. That's the alternative future you need to see clearly before it disappears. Because there was a period when Elizabeth and Philip could reasonably appear to be building a marriage in which both roles survived. She was a princess with ever-increasing responsibilities. He was a royal duke who was also a career naval officer. They had young children. They had royal obligations. But Philip still had somewhere to go that belonged to his profession, and that took them away from Buckingham Palace, away from the center of court, south across Europe, to Malta. The royal household says that from 1949 to 1951, Elizabeth and Philip lived there while he served as a naval officer with the Mediterranean fleet. The house associated with those years still stands, Villa Guardamangia. For stretches of their early marriage, it gave the future queen and her husband a home, connected not to a reign, but to Philip's naval posting. And Malta is where the significance of Philip's career becomes impossible to dismiss. Because he wasn't about to plateau, he was about to be promoted. Then the Navy was going to give him a ship. And for a brief period on a Mediterranean island, that arrangement actually worked. October 1949. Philip was back at sea. HMS Checkers was operating with the Mediterranean fleet, and Philip was serving as her first lieutenant. Elizabeth could come to Malta and spend parts of her life there with him. Not as queen, not with Philip walking 2 paces behind a sovereign, but as Princess Elizabeth, married to a serving Royal Navy officer whose working day belonged partly to his ship. Malta didn't make them ordinary. Elizabeth remained the king's heir. Royal duty didn't disappear. Security didn't disappear. Their position didn't suddenly become normal, but compared with what followed, Malta gave them a form of married life that would never again be available in quite the same way. Philip had his posting. Elizabeth could spend time in the place where her husband's career had taken him. And inside the Navy, Philip was moving forward. In July 1950, he was promoted lieutenant commander. Then came September. 11 years after entering the Royal Navy, Philip received his first seagoing command, HMS Magpie. This is where the story of the career changes. Until now, someone could still say that Philip had shown promise, that he'd served well, that he'd held responsible positions. Command is different. The Navy was giving him a ship of his own. Magpie was an anti-submarine frigate, and Philip commanded her from September 1950 into the following summer. Royal Navy records trace the ship's movements through Mediterranean ports: Izmir, Livorno, Tripoli, Athens, Monaco, Gibraltar. This wasn't a man sitting in Buckingham Palace in an admiral's uniform with nowhere to sail. His ship was moving. His career was moving. And one particular passage brings Elizabeth directly into that world. During Magpie's Mediterranean service, Princess Elizabeth joined the ship for the passage through the Corinth Canal. It's such a small episode, but it gives us one of the clearest pictures of the marriage before accession. Philip is commanding the vessel. Elizabeth is aboard his ship. The narrow canal walls rise around them. And for those hours, the future queen is traveling through a landscape determined by her husband's naval command. Soon, their public lives would work almost entirely the other way around. Philip would travel because Elizabeth's position required it. He would accompany her, support her, represent her. But here, aboard Magpie, she had entered his professional world. That's why Malta matters. Not because it proves these were secretly their happiest years. Malta matters because we can document what was different. Philip had an active profession independent of Elizabeth's royal duties. He had reached command. The young couple had a home connected to that posting, and the future that had begun at Dartmouth still looked open. How far could he have gone? That's impossible to answer by inventing an admiral's career Philip never had. But the command itself gives us better evidence than any later speculation. Someone had decided he was ready to run a ship. He was 29 years old. He wasn't finishing a naval career at retirement age. He was still near its beginning. There was also another change happening alongside the naval work. Philip's interests were widening. Science, engineering, technology, industry. Questions about how Britain worked and how it could modernize. Those interests hadn't yet become the enormous portfolio of causes and organizations associated with his later royal life. But they were already there. He was beginning to look beyond the boundaries of naval service even while he was still serving. That's going to matter, because the end of his sea command didn't leave behind an empty man waiting for Buckingham Palace to fill his calendar. There were already subjects he cared about, but none of that changes the central fact of Malta. Philip had reached the point sailors work toward, his own command, and the Royal Collection identifies Magpie as the final active naval appointment of his life. That last part wouldn't have been obvious when he first stepped aboard as commander. Nothing about taking command in September 1950 announced that this would be his only ship. Nothing about Elizabeth traveling with him through the Corinth Canal announced that soon they would never live like this again. But while Magpie was moving between Mediterranean ports, another timetable was beginning to dictate their future. It wasn't Philip's. It wasn't Elizabeth's. It belonged to the health of King George VI. The king's condition was deteriorating, and the closer Elizabeth moved toward the throne, the less room there would be for Philip to remain at sea. Philip had finally reached command. Back in Britain, George VI was becoming seriously ill, and the clock on this life was already running down. By 1951, the king's health was failing badly enough that Elizabeth and Philip were increasingly called upon to support him. The royal household describes that year as the point when the couple's life changed significantly. Elizabeth's responsibilities increased. Philip left his naval career. Their working life as a royal couple began in earnest. There's no dramatic room in the official account, no palace official slamming a folder onto a desk, no documented ultimatum. The change is easier to understand when you look at what royal duty actually required. If the king couldn't undertake an engagement, somebody had to. If an overseas visit still mattered, senior members of his family had to represent him. And because Elizabeth was heir presumptive, each increase in her father's incapacity pulled her further toward the job that would one day become hers completely. Philip was married to the person being pulled. That altered his calendar too. Magpie's command ended in July 1951. By the end of that same year, Philip wasn't being prepared for another operational ship. Instead, Elizabeth and Philip were undertaking more royal work. And in December 1951, Philip became a member of the Privy Council. Those are very different worlds. A few months earlier, his day could be shaped by the needs of an anti-submarine frigate in the Mediterranean. Now the institution around the future sovereign was drawing him deeper inside it. The shift wasn't simply from job to no job, that's too shallow. Philip was moving from a profession with an established structure into a royal position where the structure was far less clear. The Navy knew what a lieutenant commander was supposed to do. It knew what command meant. It knew how officers were assessed. It knew where authority began and ended. What, exactly, was the husband of the future queen supposed to become? Nobody could answer that with anything like the same precision. And there was another difficulty. George VI was only 55 when 1951 began. Elizabeth and Philip had always known she might one day become queen. That was built into their marriage from the beginning. What they couldn't control was the timetable. A reign that lasted another 10 or 15 years would have created one set of possibilities. A king whose health was failing now created another. Royal responsibilities expanded. Sea command stopped. The young couple began undertaking Commonwealth work in support of the king. And once Philip was no longer commanding Magpie, he never received another active sea-going appointment. The royal collection is explicit. Magpie was his final active naval posting. That's the moment when the phrase "he gave up his career" finally acquires real weight. Not at the wedding, not when George VI made him Duke of Edinburgh, not when Charles was born, not when Anne was born. Philip had continued serving through all of that. The break came when the demands surrounding Elizabeth's position grew sharply as her father's health declined. And even then, the transition wasn't clean. There was no sharp cut from naval officer on Monday to full-time consort on Tuesday. There was an overlap. Royal duty expanding while the possibility of another command disappeared. Then came February 1952. George VI died. Elizabeth became queen. And whatever uncertainty remained about whether Philip's naval career might somehow continue, had to confront an entirely new reality. He was no longer married to the heir presumptive. He was married to the sovereign. The career didn't end because Philip had failed. It ended just after he'd proved he could command. There are two dates in Philip's naval record that look like a contradiction. They're actually describing two different things. The Royal Collection says HMS Magpie was Philip's final active naval appointment. He left command in July 1951. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, dates the formal end of his active naval career to January 1953, when he held the rank of commander. Both can be true. Magpie was the last operational appointment in which Philip commanded a Royal Navy vessel, but his formal status within the service continued during the transition into his new royal position. In June 1952, several months after Elizabeth became queen, Philip was promoted to commander. The Gazette records that promotion. What didn't follow was another ship. That's the distinction that matters. Promotion existed on paper. An active command didn't return. Later, the honors became much grander. Philip eventually held the Royal Navy's highest rank and accumulated senior military appointments across the armed forces. He retained a deep connection with the Navy for the rest of his public life. He visited ships, maintained naval patronages and associations, spent long periods aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia, continued appearing in naval uniform on major occasions. But none of that should be confused with the career he'd been living in Malta. An admiral of the fleet attending a state occasion is one thing. A lieutenant commander responsible for an operational frigate is another. One is rank, honor, and continuing identification with the service. The other is a profession being lived every day. Philip never again received the second. That's why Magpie deserves one last look before we leave her behind. Not because she was a famous battleship, she wasn't. Not because Philip fought some great battle aboard her, he didn't. Her importance is more personal and more practical. This was the ship on which Philip finally became the commanding officer, and inside his cabin aboard Magpie, there's evidence that another part of his future was already taking shape. In 1951, while still serving in the Mediterranean, Philip prepared a major speech. He was president that year of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. The subject he chose was Britain's contribution to science and technology over the previous 100 years, and the royal household records that Philip wrote that address in his cabin aboard HMS Magpie. A naval officer sitting inside the cabin of the only ship he'd ever command, writing about science, technology, and Britain's industrial development. One working life was approaching its end. The subjects that would help fill the next one were already on the page in front of him. There was even a family connection buried inside the occasion. 100 years earlier, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband and Philip's great-great-grandfather, had held the same presidency. But Philip's position was going to be different from Albert's. Different century, different monarchy, different constitutional expectations, and a queen who would reign far longer than anyone standing aboard Magpie in 1951 could have known. The Navy itself didn't disappear from Philip's identity. It stayed in the uniforms he wore, the organizations he supported, the ships he visited, the language of duty, efficiency, and practical responsibility that followed him into royal life. But after Magpie, it stopped being the place where his working future was decided. That's what the later titles can obscure. He could be made commander. He could be given the highest naval rank. He could stand in naval uniform beside the Queen for decades. But nobody gave him another operational ship, and there was no returning to the version of married life in which Elizabeth could come aboard Philip's command for a passage through the Mediterranean and go home with him to Malta. That part was finished. What replaced it wasn't yet obvious. Philip was 30. He had decades of working life ahead of him. He was married to a woman whose position was about to place extraordinary limits around his own. He had no independent constitutional office waiting to replace the Bridge of Magpie. No established career ladder for husband of the Queen. No manual telling him what useful work should look like from this point forward. But sitting in that cabin in 1951, writing about science and technology, Philip had already started pointing toward an answer. If you're watching this and wondering how the rest of Philip's life took shape after losing the Navy, hit subscribe now, because what happened next is even more revealing than what he lost. On the 31st of January 1952, Elizabeth and Philip left London for a Commonwealth tour that King George VI had been too ill to make himself. That detail changes the whole meaning of the trip. They weren't traveling because Elizabeth had become queen, they were traveling because she hadn't. Her father was still sovereign, and his elder daughter was stepping in where his health no longer allowed him to go. Philip went with her. The royal household records that the couple departed London Airport together, beginning with Kenya before the tour was supposed to carry them much further across the Commonwealth. They never completed it. On the 6th of February, George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham. He was 56. His daughter was thousands of miles away in Kenya. There was no waiting for a coronation, no vote, no ceremony required before the change could take effect. At the moment the king died, Princess Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II. The royal household states it plainly. She acceded immediately. One life ended in Norfolk, another reign began in Africa, and Philip's position changed at exactly the same moment. He hadn't inherited anything. He hadn't become king. He hadn't been given the sovereign's authority. But the woman he'd married in 1947 was no longer Princess Elizabeth. She was the monarch. Elizabeth had left Britain as a princess. She returned as queen. When the aircraft landed in London on the 7th of February, Winston Churchill and other senior officials were waiting to receive her. She went back to Clarence House, and the royal standard was flown there for the first time in her reign. For Elizabeth, the change had a name, sovereign. There were laws, precedents, advisors, ceremonies, and centuries of constitutional practice surrounding what came next. For Philip, the answer was far less obvious. What, exactly, was the husband of a reigning British queen supposed to be? It sounds like a simple question until you look at how rarely Britain had needed to answer it. Philip was the first husband of a reigning British monarch since Prince Albert died in 1861. The Gazette notes that the precedents available for the husband of a sovereign were limited. There were plenty of precedents for kings, there were plenty for queens, there were established expectations for a queen consort married to a king. A man married to the woman who held the crown was different. Philip couldn't simply take the place traditionally occupied by a king's wife and change the gender of the title. He wasn't going to become King Philip, and he couldn't continue behaving simply as the naval officer married to the king's daughter, because that woman now carried the constitutional responsibilities of the crown everywhere she went. This is where the two lives finally separate. The professional future Philip had built depended on assignments, promotion, and active service. Elizabeth's future no longer depended on anything. It had arrived, immediately, permanently. The difference wasn't romantic, it was constitutional. The official machinery moved quickly. An accession council proclaimed Elizabeth sovereign. On the 8th of February, she made her accession declaration before the Privy Council. The Gazette records her promise to uphold constitutional government and work for the happiness and prosperity of her peoples. Philip's position in that moment tells you everything. He isn't making the declaration. He isn't sharing the crown. He isn't taking a parallel oath as a second sovereign. The constitutional authority belongs to Elizabeth. Philip is beside her. That's the relationship that would define the next 69 years of their marriage, not two people with equal constitutional roles. A sovereign and the sovereign's husband. That didn't mean Philip had no importance. Over time, Elizabeth would give him extraordinary precedence, and he would create a working role of enormous scale. But none of that was automatic on the 6th of February. The monarchy knew what Elizabeth had become. Philip still had to find out what his place beside her would actually look like, and almost immediately, that uncertainty reached into something deeply personal and highly symbolic: a name. Philip had entered his marriage as Mountbatten. Elizabeth had married him as Princess Elizabeth, Duchess of Edinburgh. Now she was queen, and with a new reign beginning, the question was no longer what surname a married couple might use in private life. It was what name would stand over the royal house itself. There are two words in this story that sound as though they should mean the same thing. They don't. Surname. Royal house. That distinction is where much of the confusion about Philip begins. A surname is the family name an individual may need for ordinary legal or personal purposes. A royal house is something broader. It's a dynastic identity, attached to the reigning family. Mix those together and you get the familiar claim that Philip simply wasn't allowed to give his children his name. The real record is more complicated, and far more interesting. Philip had become Mountbatten in 1947. Elizabeth married him that year. Then came accession. A decision had to be made about the dynastic identity of the new reign. The House of Windsor itself was relatively young. George V had adopted the name in 1917 during the First World War, replacing the German dynastic styling associated with Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Windsor connected the monarchy with one of its great English royal residences and with a name deeply rooted in British royal history. 35 years later, George V's granddaughter sat on the throne. Her husband was Mountbatten, so which name would continue? On the 9th of April 1952, the answer became official. At a meeting of the Privy Council at Clarence House, Elizabeth declared that she and her children would continue to be styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor. Mountbatten did not replace Windsor as the name of the royal house. That's the fact. The symbolism is impossible to miss. Philip had changed his own official identity before the marriage. He'd entered British public life as Mountbatten. Now his wife had become sovereign, and the dynasty over which she presided would not take the name he'd adopted. And the wording is especially important. The declaration wasn't simply about what Charles might write on a school form, it was about the House and Family of Windsor. That's dynastic language. It places the decision at the level of monarchy itself. There's a way to prove this without relying on anyone's memory written decades afterward. 8 years later, Elizabeth revisited the surname question. When she made a new declaration in February 1960, that document began by restating what she'd done in 1952. The later declaration records her earlier decision that she and her children would be styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor. That gives us the Queen's own formal record looking backward. No newspaper reconstruction, no court gossip. The declaration survives. But the 1952 decision wasn't the final word. Elizabeth would reconsider part of the arrangement in 1960. For now, one point matters. In April 1952, the new reign remained Windsor. That decision tells us something about the institution Philip had married. Marriage could bring him inside the royal family. It could give him British titles. It could place him beside the sovereign. But marriage didn't mean the institution simply reorganized itself around him. The crown had its own history, its own continuity, its own rules. And Philip was now living inside that structure rather than commanding a separate professional structure of his own. The family name remained Windsor. The more difficult adjustment wasn't written in the name, it was written into Philip's constitutional position. Philip was married to the most powerful symbol in the British Constitution. That didn't give him constitutional power of his own. This is where the word freedom in his story needs careful handling. Royal life didn't make Philip a prisoner. It didn't erase his ability to speak, think, travel, create projects, or build an enormous program of work. But it did put a very clear boundary around one thing: authority. The royal household's description of Philip's role is unusually direct. The consort's primary purpose was to provide companionship and moral and practical support to the sovereign. And then comes the line that tells us what the role was not. The consort held no formal position in the structure of government. Philip didn't see state papers. He didn't hold official audiences. Those are small sentences with large consequences. Because think about the professional structure Philip had just left. On a naval ship, rank defined responsibility. Appointment defined authority. The commanding officer didn't stand beside somebody else who held command. The position itself carried powers and duties. Royal consortship worked differently. Philip could be extraordinarily close to the person exercising the sovereign's functions without exercising those functions himself. He wasn't co-sovereign. He couldn't turn marriage into governmental authority. He couldn't take Elizabeth's constitutional work and divide half of it onto his own desk. And he didn't become king. There's a reason the 1953 coronation would treat him differently from the wife of a male sovereign. A queen consort can be crowned and anointed alongside her husband. The husband of a reigning queen is not crowned and anointed in the same way. The royal household explicitly records that distinction, so when people describe Philip as giving up his freedom, the factual version is more interesting than the dramatic one. The real constraint wasn't that palace doors were locked behind him. It was that the shape of his public life had to work around an office he could never occupy. Elizabeth had become the crown. Philip had to build usefulness beside it, and the monarchy understood that his place needed clarification. On the 18th of September 1952, Elizabeth issued another formal declaration. This one concerned Philip directly. She granted the Duke of Edinburgh a place, preeminence, and precedence next to Her Majesty. The Gazette published the declaration later that month. In practical terms, it placed Philip immediately beside the Queen in precedence, a position the royal household notes would ordinarily belong to the heir to the throne. That's an extraordinary distinction, but watch what it doesn't say. It doesn't say Philip shares sovereignty. It doesn't make him king. It doesn't create a governmental office. It doesn't hand him state papers. It gives him position, not power. That difference is the whole story of his early consortship. Elizabeth could elevate his standing beside her. She couldn't turn him into another sovereign without fundamentally changing what the monarchy was, and there was little modern guidance for what he should do instead. Prince Albert offered one historical comparison, but Victoria and Albert belonged to another century. Philip now faced the same basic problem in a very different Britain. How does a man accustomed to responsibility create a working identity when the highest office in the household belongs permanently to his wife? The answer wasn't going to come from constitutional power, so it had to come from usefulness. Philip wasn't a defeated husband pushed into the shadows. The records don't support that. He had status. He had access. He had the confidence of the sovereign. He had precedence next to her. But his role had to be built around support rather than rule. And Philip would spend years pushing at the practical edges of what that could mean. Science, industry, technology, youth work, conservation, the running of royal estates, the modernization of the palace itself, those things would come. But first, Britain was going to see the relationship between sovereign and husband expressed in public with almost medieval clarity, not in an office, not in a memo, inside Westminster Abbey. On the 2nd of June 1953, Philip traveled from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey in full-dress Royal Navy uniform. Over that uniform, inside the Abbey, he wore his duke's robe and coronet. The Navy hadn't vanished from the man. You could still see it on him, but the ceremony he was about to enter belonged entirely to Elizabeth's office. The coronation service moved through its ancient stages: recognition, oath, anointing, investiture, crowning, enthronement, homage. Elizabeth took the coronation oath. She was anointed. She received the regalia. St. Edward's crown was placed on her head. Philip received none of those things. That wasn't a slight against him. It was the constitutional distinction made ceremonial. He was the queen's husband. He wasn't the queen, and he wasn't a king. Then came homage. The archbishops and bishops went first. Immediately after them came Philip. The royal household records that he was the first peer to do homage to the Queen. He approached the newly crowned sovereign. He knelt. Westminster Abbey's own record preserves the opening of his promise. I, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, do become your liege man of life and limb. Now the scene from the beginning of our story carries a different weight. At first, we saw a former naval commander kneeling before his wife. Now we can see what the ceremony was actually saying. Philip wasn't surrendering his dignity. He was publicly locating himself inside the reign. There was Elizabeth, the sovereign, and there was Philip, her husband, her highest-ranking companion, her first peer in homage, but still her subject. The distinction was visible to millions. The 1953 coronation was the first British coronation carried live on television. The royal household estimates that roughly 27 million people in Britain watched on television, while another 11 million listened by radio. This wasn't a private adjustment behind palace walls. The relationship had been made ceremonial before the country and Commonwealth. Philip's naval uniform sat underneath the robes. Elizabeth wore the crown, and the oath he gave her wasn't a marriage vow. They'd already made those promises in the same abbey in 1947. This was something different. The Dean of Westminster, Dr. David Hoyle, returned to that distinction after Philip's death in 2021. He noted that Philip had first come to the abbey to pledge himself in marriage to Princess Elizabeth. In 1953, he came back and made a promise to his queen. The Dean described that promise as one Philip kept throughout his life, and remembered him as someone reluctant to pull attention toward himself. That later witness matters, because it doesn't ask us to guess whether Philip liked kneeling. It asks us to look at what he did afterward. He kept turning up, beside her at state occasions, alongside her on tours, representing her when required, building work of his own without confusing that work with sovereignty. The constitutional framework had told him what he couldn't be. Not king, not co-sovereign, not a government office holder simply because he'd married the Queen. The Navy was no longer going to give him another operational command. Philip was 32 years old at the coronation. He potentially had decades of working life ahead. He needed something worth doing, and the answer wouldn't come from another title. It would come from the parts of Philip that had already appeared before accession. The fascination with systems, engineering, science, technology, and practical improvement. Kneeling didn't mean disappearing. Philip's next problem was finding work important enough for a man who was no longer allowed to build his future through the Navy. Philip's new position came with a strange problem. He was expected to work, but nobody had handed him a profession. No established ladder for the husband of a reigning queen, no next command, no promotion examination, no ship waiting at the end of a successful posting. So Philip began building a working life around things that genuinely interested him: science, engineering, industrial development, technology, conservation, education, not as decorations around royal duty, but as subjects he kept returning to for decades. The royal household describes him as an advocate for scientific and industrial progress, technological modernization, and wildlife conservation. It also records that he prepared his own speeches rather than simply accepting words produced for him by somebody else. He wanted material he could get his hands on, technical questions, processes, problems with practical answers, and sometimes the problem was sitting right inside Buckingham Palace. After Elizabeth became queen, Philip became heavily involved in modernizing how the palace worked as both a home and an office. Take paperwork. Royal households generate mountains of it: correspondence, engagement papers, briefings, invitations, speeches, administrative files. Philip didn't just complain about the filing system. He helped design a new one for his own office. Then he designed rotating shelves to hold the papers. Those shelves were still in use decades later. It's such a Philip detail. Not a grand speech about modernization. A shelf that turns because somebody worked out that the papers can be reached more efficiently that way. Then came communication. In the 1950s, he introduced a dictograph internal communication system into his office at Buckingham Palace, allowing staff to communicate more efficiently within the building. And his interest in technology wasn't a brief enthusiasm. As early as 1953, Philip had a radio telephone fitted to his personal car. Much later, in the 1980s, he was using an early British personal computer, an Apricot, and continued working with computers for correspondence, speeches, and books. Look at the pattern forming. The institution had given Philip very little independent constitutional authority, so he concentrated on areas where authority wasn't the point. Could something work better? Could information move faster? Could an old system be improved? Could new technology solve a practical problem? The habits were remarkably compatible with the life he'd just left. A ship runs on systems. Communication has to work. Equipment has to work. People need to know what they're responsible for. A badly organized procedure can't survive forever simply because it's traditional. Buckingham Palace, by contrast, was an institution built on tradition. Philip wasn't trying to abolish that tradition. He was asking whether tradition required inefficient filing cabinets. There's a difference. That distinction became a feature of his public interest too. He supported organizations concerned with engineering and industry. He took an interest in scientific research and technological development. He became chancellor of several universities. He followed developments in agriculture. Conservation eventually became another major field of work. And his interest wasn't only in the finished invention. He was drawn to the people who made things work. Engineers, scientists, industrial managers, researchers, technicians, people whose contribution often happened far away from ceremonial rooms. That gave Philip something his royal life badly needed him to find. A field of usefulness that belonged to him without challenging the Queen's constitutional position. He couldn't become a second sovereign. He could become an extremely active consort with subjects of his own. Elizabeth's desk carried the constitutional business of the sovereign. Philip's office could be filled with engineering papers, speeches, correspondence, diagrams, and questions about how something might work better. He was finding room inside a role that hadn't arrived with a proper job description. But there was one area where Elizabeth went further than simply allowing Philip to develop outside interests. After becoming queen, she asked him to take responsibility for the strategic management of royal estates at Windsor, Sandringham, and Balmoral. He remained involved in those decisions for decades. Now Philip wasn't merely advising an organization or making a speech about better methods. Decisions had real consequences on actual land, trees, farms, buildings, water, wildlife, machinery. Elizabeth gave him one field where he could make decisions that would last far beyond any court ceremony. At Sandringham, Philip wasn't there to cut a ribbon. He was helping decide how the place would be run. The royal household records that at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, Philip took overall responsibility for the management of the Sandringham estate. He also remained closely involved with Balmoral and with Windsor Great and Home Parks. That gave him something royal ceremonial work couldn't. Long consequences. Plant a tree and you might wait decades to see what it becomes. Change the way land is farmed and the effect may only become clear after years. Alter woodland management and somebody else may inherit the result. Philip stayed involved with that kind of problem for most of his married life. At Sandringham, conservation became part of the management strategy. The royal household records initiatives to improve habitat for ground-nesting birds, the establishment of more than 100 miles of field margins, extensive tree planting, new hedges, and wetland creation. That's a very different picture of Philip from the one produced by ceremonial photographs. No medals, no throne room, just land management. At Windsor, he became Ranger of Windsor Great Park in 1952 and advised on farms, woodland, and wildlife. He later encouraged the replanting of Queen Anne's Ride with roughly 1,000 young oak trees and supported the creation of the Windsor Farm Shop. But Balmoral gives perhaps the clearest glimpse of how hands-on his involvement could be. One of the problems was heating. When Balmoral wasn't occupied, how do you protect an old building, along with paintings, furniture, and fabric, without simply heating rooms according to ordinary temperature changes? Philip suggested a control system based on changes in humidity rather than only falling temperature. The purpose was better protection of the contents in the building itself. Again, a system, a practical problem, a technical answer. Then there were the gardens. Philip gradually redesigned parts of them. He developed a vegetable garden. He created a paved and flowered walk. He developed a water garden, and according to the royal household, he helped dig that water garden himself, with a bulldozer. A Duke of Edinburgh climbing onto a bulldozer at Balmoral is far more revealing than another photograph of him standing behind the Queen at a reception. It shows why this work mattered to him. He could make something. He could alter something. He could come back and see whether it worked. The same pattern appeared in forestry. Ballochbuie Forest on the Balmoral estate contains one of the largest remaining areas of native Caledonian pine woodland. In the early 1970s, Philip suggested enclosing a small trial area to test whether natural regeneration could be encouraged by controlling grazing pressure. The trial worked well enough that larger areas were enclosed later. By 1992, the protected area had grown dramatically, and the regeneration program continued to be monitored by researchers and scientists. That's exactly the kind of detail this story needs, because it prevents the word conservation from becoming an empty label. There was a hypothesis. Try something on a small area. Watch what happens, expand if the evidence supports it. The estates also gave Philip direct exposure to farming. He followed agricultural technology, encouraged managers to consider new ideas, maintained an interest in cattle and agricultural shows, and supported discussions about modern farming methods. And none of this made him the sovereign. That's precisely why it worked. Elizabeth retained the constitutional responsibilities that belonged only to her, while Philip exercised judgment in areas she had specifically entrusted to him. There was room for decisions, room for experimentation, room for responsibility, and most importantly, room for results that could be measured. A plantation either survived or it didn't. A heating system either protected the building or it didn't. A conservation trial either encouraged regeneration or it didn't. Philip wasn't trying to turn Balmoral into HMS Magpie, but you can see why the estates suited him. They rewarded patience, observation, and practical thinking. They also gave him something the public rarely saw when they looked at the man walking behind the Queen: continuity of his own. At Sandringham, Balmoral, and Windsor, some decisions he helped make would still be visible years after the meeting in which they were approved had been forgotten. Trees grow slowly. Land remembers. But there was another part of Philip's old working identity that couldn't be recreated with farms, forests, or filing systems: the sea. And soon an extraordinary new ship would bring that part of him back into royal life in a form nobody quite expected. When the Royal Yacht Britannia was launched in 1953, Philip wasn't standing on the bridge of a ship under his command. That chapter had closed. But Britannia gave his naval experience somewhere new to go. The yacht had to serve several purposes at once: a working royal vessel, a residence, a place for official entertaining, a platform for overseas diplomacy, and a ship capable of carrying the monarch and members of the royal family across enormous distances. Philip became directly involved in its design. The Royal Collection Trust records that he took an active role in the yacht's technical planning, drawing on his practical experience in the Royal Navy, and also contributed to the interiors of the royal apartments. He wasn't simply choosing curtains. His experience at sea was relevant again. How should spaces work aboard ship? How should technical requirements fit alongside royal use? How could a vessel function as both ship and traveling royal residence? For the first time since his active naval career had narrowed, there was a major project where being both a royal husband and a trained naval officer weren't competing identities. They were useful together. Britannia belonged to the crown, but Philip understood ships, and unlike Magpie, this vessel would become woven through the next 4 decades of royal life. It carried Elizabeth and Philip on tours. It reached ports around the Commonwealth. It hosted receptions and official events. It also gave Philip the chance to undertake work independently from the Queen. That became particularly visible in 1956. Philip left on what the Royal Collection Trust identifies as his first solo overseas tour aboard Britannia. Elizabeth wasn't with him. This wasn't a return to the Malta arrangement. Philip hadn't resumed an independent Navy career. Britannia wasn't his operational command. Every mile traveled belonged to his royal role. But within that role, the tour created something he hadn't had in quite the same form since accession: a defined mission, a ship, a long itinerary, and responsibility carried out without Elizabeth physically beside him. The most public stop came in Australia, Melbourne. Philip formally opened the Olympic Games. For millions watching, he was now unmistakably Prince Philip, the royal figure. But the voyage kept going after the Olympic flame was lit. Britannia carried him further south, much further, into Antarctic waters. The Royal Collection records the Antarctic visit as part of the 1956-57 tour. Artist Edward Seago traveled with Philip and produced paintings of the Antarctic landscape during the voyage. And here Philip's story suddenly looks different again. Not palace corridors, not formal precedents, not questions about what surname the dynasty would use. Open water, a ship moving south, ice, scientific interest, remote territory. The scene connects several parts of his life without forcing them together. The sailor, the consort, the man interested in science, the representative traveling on behalf of the monarchy. All four could exist aboard the same vessel. That's what Britannia offered him, not the restoration of the career he'd lost. Something new built partly from its remains. The better way to understand Philip isn't a list of thousands of engagements. A factory on Monday, a university on Tuesday, a conservation meeting after that. Lists make enormous workloads feel strangely empty. The pattern tells you more. He repeatedly found places where an earlier skill could serve a new function. Naval experience became useful in yacht design. Interest in machinery became involvement in technological modernization. Concern with efficient organization found a place inside palace administration. Practical interest in land became estate management. None of those things recreated HMS Magpie. They didn't need to. Philip's second working life wasn't a copy of the first. It was assembled from pieces of experience that still had somewhere useful to go. And the 1956 to 57 voyage shows that process already well advanced. Less than 5 years after accession had destroyed any realistic prospect of continuing the naval career, Philip was again traveling thousands of miles by sea. But now he wasn't moving through a naval chain of command. He was representing the crown. That's the difference between Malta and Britannia. In Malta, Elizabeth entered Philip's professional world. On Britannia, Philip's maritime world had been absorbed into Elizabeth's reign, yet something else was being built at almost exactly the same time. And this next project had nothing to do with palaces or royal yachts. Instead, it led back to a Scottish school and a headmaster Philip had known as a teenager, Kurt Hahn. In 1954, Hahn approached his former Gordonstoun pupil with an idea. The Duke of Edinburgh's award organization records that Philip first considered the creation of a national program for young people's development that year, at Hahn's request. That corrects another easy simplification. Philip didn't wake up one morning and invent the award alone. The idea developed from conversations and educational principles associated with Hahn and others. Philip's importance was that he backed it, shaped it, gave it standing, and stayed personally involved. The connection to Gordonstoun wasn't accidental. Hahn had long believed that education should stretch beyond examinations. Young people should have opportunities to develop physical ability, learn practical skills, serve other people, take responsibility, discover what they could do when something difficult was placed in front of them. The Royal Collection Trust describes Gordonstoun as a school that placed strong emphasis on physical activity, service to the local community, and helping pupils develop their abilities. It also identifies Hahn as the person who later suggested Philip establish a youth program built around those principles. By 1956, the program was launched. The royal household records that Philip instituted the Duke of Edinburgh's award that year to encourage service and physical development among young people. At first, nobody could know how large it would become. Today, it's easy to look backward at the finished institution. Millions of participants, schools, youth organizations, bronze, silver, and gold awards, international expansion. But in 1956, it was an experiment. Could young people be given structured challenges outside ordinary classroom achievement? Could the program reward persistence rather than privilege? Could a teenager discover an ability that examination marks had never shown? The modern DAFI organization describes the purpose in strikingly simple terms, giving young people opportunities to prove to themselves what they're capable of. It also preserves a line attributed to Philip that captures the philosophy neatly. There is more in you than you might think. That sentence fits Philip's public life far better than any long speech about royal duty. The award gave his consortship something it badly needed: continuity. Philip could visit a participant at 14. Another could complete the program years later. The organization could grow beyond any single royal engagement. It wasn't finished when he left the room, and Philip stayed deeply involved. The award organization records that he remained chairman of trustees until his 80th birthday, and continued as patron throughout his life. In 2013, he attended his 500th Gold Award presentation in the United Kingdom. 500. That's not the record of a man who lent his title to an organization and forgot about it. And the program eventually spread far beyond Britain. The DAF organization states that the award developed into an international network reaching more than 130 countries and territories. Now look at how far we've come from February 1952. At accession, Philip faced a role defined largely by what he couldn't do. He couldn't share sovereignty. He couldn't continue building an operational navy career. There wasn't a ready-made profession called Queen's husband waiting to occupy the next 40 years. By the middle of the decade, that picture already looked different. He was involved in modernizing the royal household. He'd been given responsibility for major royal estates. His naval knowledge had helped shape Britannia. He'd undertaken an independent overseas tour, and now his name stood over a youth program designed to keep working when Philip himself wasn't in the room. His first career had come with a structure somebody else had built. Training, ranks, appointments, command. His second working life had to be assembled piece by piece, and some of those pieces became much larger than the position from which they started. On the 22nd of February, 1957, another document changed Philip's name in public life. Not his surname this time, his title. Letters patent were issued under the Great Seal, granting the Duke of Edinburgh the style and titular dignity of a Prince of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The Gazette then stated exactly how he was to be known from that day forward. His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. There's something almost circular about that. Philip had entered the world as a prince. Now, 35 years later, he was formally a prince again. But these weren't the same titles separated by a decade. The prince born on Corfu in 1921 had belonged to the Greek and Danish royal families. The Prince Philip, created in 1957, held a British princely dignity granted by his wife as sovereign. One identity hadn't simply been returned to him. A new one had been created. That's why Philip's name story becomes misleading when it's compressed into a single sentence. His official identity kept changing long after the wedding. First, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, then Philip Mountbatten, then His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. Now, His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. The royal household confirms that Elizabeth created her husband a Prince of the United Kingdom in 1957, 5 years into her reign. And notice the timing. This didn't happen when they married in 1947. It didn't happen when Elizabeth became queen in 1952. It didn't happen before the coronation. For several years of his wife's reign, Philip remained formally the Duke of Edinburgh without the British princely title that later became so familiar it can seem as though he'd always possessed it. He hadn't. The letters patent changed that, but they didn't change the basic structure of his position. Becoming a British prince didn't make Philip king. It didn't make him co-sovereign. It didn't give him Elizabeth's constitutional authority. The title altered his formal status and styling. It didn't alter who wore the crown. Philip's life after accession was full of impressive titles: Admiral of the Fleet, Field Marshal, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Prince of the United Kingdom. Yet none recreated the independent professional path he'd once had at sea, and none placed him alongside Elizabeth as another holder of sovereign power. So why does 1957 matter? Because it shows that Philip's identity inside the monarchy was still being formed. 5 years after accession, the institution hadn't frozen him into the position he'd occupied in February 1952. His place beside Elizabeth was still being defined. His working interests were expanding, his public role was growing. There's also a quiet irony in the sequence. The man who had renounced one princely identity before marrying Elizabeth didn't spend the rest of his life as Mr. Mountbatten with a dukedom attached. Elizabeth herself granted him another princely dignity, British this time, and from that point, the name by which millions would know him for the rest of his life was finally complete: Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Still Mountbatten where a surname mattered. Still husband of the sovereign. Still not the source of the dynasty's name, but that last point was about to be revisited. Because the 1952 declaration had kept the royal house firmly Windsor. Mountbatten hadn't replaced it. Yet that didn't mean Philip's family name had vanished from the future of Elizabeth's descendants. The official record was going to change one more time, and this time the Queen's declaration would spell out exactly where Mountbatten belonged and where Windsor would remain untouched. The document is dated the 8th of February 1960, Buckingham Palace. The Queen in Council. It begins by looking backward. Elizabeth restated her declaration of the 9th of April 1952. She and her children were to be styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor. Windsor was staying. That point never changed. Then comes the new part. Elizabeth said she had given further consideration to descendants who wouldn't enjoy the style of Royal Highness or the titular dignity of Prince or Princess, and who would therefore actually need a surname. For those descendants, the 1952 arrangement would be altered. The name would be Mountbatten Windsor. That one document clears up several myths at once. The royal house did not become Mountbatten. It remained Windsor. Elizabeth didn't erase Windsor and replace it with Philip's surname. But Philip's name wasn't permanently shut out of the family either. Mountbatten now had an official place in the surname of certain descendants of Elizabeth and Philip. The royal household explains the distinction clearly. Members of the royal family can have both the name of a royal house and a surname, and those things aren't necessarily the same. In 1960, Elizabeth and Philip wanted their own direct descendants to be distinguishable from the wider royal family without changing the name of the royal house itself. That's the part later retellings often flatten. Windsor was the dynasty. Mountbatten Windsor became the surname available within Elizabeth and Philip's direct line under the terms of the declaration, and for many senior royals, a surname wouldn't normally be needed at all. A person styled His or Her Royal Highness and Prince or Princess could move through public and official life almost entirely by title. That's why arguments over whether Philip's children had his name can become misleading very quickly. Royal naming doesn't work quite like the surname on an ordinary household letterbox, and there's a small detail that shows how rarely that surname initially needed to appear. According to the royal household, Mountbatten Windsor first appeared on an official document in 1973 when Princess Anne used it in the marriage register at Westminster Abbey, 13 years after the declaration. That tells us what this decision actually was. Not a renaming of the monarchy, not a public replacement of Windsor, a carefully defined family surname. In 1952, Mountbatten hadn't become the name of the royal house. In 1960, Elizabeth formally placed Mountbatten alongside Windsor in the surname available to their descendants under specified circumstances. Philip's name had found a place in the family record after all, and that brings one half of our title almost full circle. His identity had changed repeatedly. His relationship to the name Mountbatten had been reshaped by marriage, accession, and dynasty, but the documents eventually show both names surviving. Windsor, Mountbatten, together, without either meaning quite the same thing as the other. The other great thing Philip had surrendered followed a very different path. There was no declaration 8 years later restoring it, no compromise name, no constitutional formula that gave him half of it back. His name found a place in the family after all. The career never came back. There's one distinction we've saved until now. Philip never stopped being a naval man. He stopped being a working naval officer. Those are not the same thing. After his active career ended, the uniforms remained. The service connections remained. The Navy remained woven through his public life for decades. In 1953, Philip was appointed Admiral of the Fleet. He also became Field Marshal and Marshal of the Royal Air Force, while holding a series of senior ceremonial and service appointments. Later, he served as Captain General Royal Marines for more than 60 years. The royal household records that he continued visiting units, meeting serving personnel, and maintaining close involvement with military organizations throughout his public life. Then, on his 90th birthday in 2011, Elizabeth gave him another distinction, Lord High Admiral of the Royal Navy, one of the oldest great offices associated with the service, placing another naval title beside Philip's name at an age when most men had been retired for decades. But none of those honors put him back where HMS Magpie had once put him, in operational command. A title can recognize what someone has been. A profession gives them something to do tomorrow morning. Philip had plenty to do tomorrow morning, more, eventually, than almost anyone could reasonably fit into one working life. But another command never came. The Navy's own historical account says his active service ended after almost 14 years. From then on, his naval connection continued through official visits, associations, charities, Royal Yacht Britannia, and the ships that accompanied overseas tours. The real dividing line is simpler than counting ranks. Before accession, the Navy could decide Philip's next posting. After accession, the Crown increasingly decided the shape of his working life. And perhaps that's why HMS Magpie matters so much at the end of this story. Not because she was the largest ship he served aboard. Not because she carried the greatest wartime story. Because she was the last place where the professional structure Philip had chosen for himself reached its natural reward, command. After that, his usefulness had to take another shape. And it did. He found science, industry, engineering, conservation, youth development, estate management, technology, royal service. He didn't spend the next 6 decades publicly mourning a career he no longer had. The historical record gives us no justification for turning Philip into a man who secretly spent his life wishing he could escape the monarchy and return to sea. The Navy remained part of Philip's identity for the rest of his life. It simply stopped being his profession. And that leaves us with the hardest part of the title. What did all of this actually cost him? The documents can tell us what disappeared. They can't measure disappointment. A service record can't tell us what Philip thought late at night. A Gazette notice can't tell us whether one change hurt more than another. And Philip himself rarely supplied the kind of public emotional confession that would make the answer easy. But after 50 years of marriage, someone who had watched almost the entire transformation from closer than anybody else finally said something remarkable about the debt behind it. Elizabeth. The 20th of November, 1997. Exactly 50 years since Elizabeth and Philip walked out of Westminster Abbey as husband and wife. At a lunch at Banqueting House in London, the Queen stood to speak about those 50 years. The official transcript survives in the Royal Household Archive. For most of the speech, Elizabeth did what monarchs generally do. She talked about Britain, about change, about institutions, about the people who had supported the royal family. Then, near the end, she turned toward her husband. The language changed. Elizabeth acknowledged something those who'd watched Philip for decades already knew. Compliments made him uncomfortable. He was far more likely to make a dry remark than sit quietly while somebody praised him. Then she said, "He has, quite simply, been my strength and stay all these years." That sentence became famous, but it isn't even the most important part. Elizabeth continued by saying that the debt owed to Philip was greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know. And there, after everything we followed, is probably the closest this story can honestly come to an emotional verdict. Not from a biographer trying to make Philip more tragic, not from a newspaper reconstructing an argument decades later. From Elizabeth, the woman whose accession had changed the structure of his life. She didn't tell the audience Philip had regretted marrying her. She didn't say he'd resented the crown. She didn't describe him as trapped. What she acknowledged was a debt. And then she added something especially revealing about the man himself. It was a debt Philip wouldn't claim, because the archive can take us only so far. It can show us the legal changes around his identity. It can show us the official documents. It can show us where Mountbatten entered the record and where Windsor remained. The Royal Navy can show us the career that existed, the responsibilities Philip earned, and the point at which active service stopped. The Constitution can show us what being married to the sovereign did and didn't allow. His later work can show us how he responded when there was no established profession waiting for a queen's husband. But none of those records can produce an invoice for the personal cost. There's no document marked, "This is what Philip gave up, this is how much it hurt, this is what he wished had happened instead," and perhaps there shouldn't be, because reducing 73 years of marriage to a ledger of sacrifice would flatten both Philip and Elizabeth. He gained things, too. A marriage that lasted more than 7 decades, children, grandchildren, a public platform of extraordinary scale, the chance to build organizations and support fields he'd cared about for years, a working partnership with the sovereign that became one of the defining relationships of Elizabeth's reign. The point isn't that royal life took everything from Philip. It didn't. The point is that royal life required one version of Philip's future to close so another could exist, and Elizabeth understood that the second version depended heavily on something from him: constancy. Look again at Westminster Abbey in 1953. Elizabeth sits crowned. Philip comes forward. He kneels. At the beginning of this story, the scene looked almost like a reversal, the naval commander lowering himself before his wife. Now it means something different. Philip wasn't disappearing in that moment. He was publicly accepting the structure within which the rest of his life would have to operate. Elizabeth would reign. Philip would stand beside her, not equal in constitutional authority, not subordinate in the ordinary meaning of a marriage, but occupying a position the British monarchy barely knew how to define when he first entered it, and then he spent decades defining it through what he did. 44 years after the coronation, the Queen finally turned toward that man in public and acknowledged what his position had meant to hers. Not with a list of engagements, not with another title, with 2 words: strength, stay. And perhaps the line that followed tells us even more. The debt, Elizabeth said, was larger than Philip himself would ever claim. That isn't proof of some hidden suffering we've uncovered. It's something better. It's the closest witness to his life, telling us that there was more behind the public role than Philip was ever inclined to advertise. We could leave Philip in Westminster Abbey, but that's not where he belongs. There's another image. June 2018. A Royal Navy ship is being welcomed into service at Devonport. Her name is HMS Magpie, not Philip's Magpie, a new vessel carrying the old name. Philip is 97 by then. He doesn't attend the commissioning, but a message from him does. And for a man who supposedly never talked about what the Navy had meant to him, the first thing he chooses to recall is striking. He remembers the honor of commanding the earlier HMS Magpie in Malta after the war and sends his good wishes to the new ship and her company. 67 years had passed since his own command ended. 67. The monarchy had changed. Britain had changed. The empire had largely disappeared. The royal yacht Britannia had sailed more than 1,000,000 miles and then been retired. Philip had traveled across the world, delivered speeches, opened buildings, challenged industrialists, promoted engineers, worked with conservationists, and watched generations of young people complete the award carrying his title. He'd become Admiral of the Fleet, later Lord High Admiral. But when the name Magpie returned to the Royal Navy, Philip still knew exactly what that name connected him to: his ship, his command, his profession. Not bitterness, not regret, just recognition. That's a better place to leave him, alive. 97 years old, still connected to the service that first gave him a career he could call his own. When you look at Philip's life this way, what do you believe was the greater sacrifice? Was it leaving the naval career he'd trained for, fought through a war to build, and finally reached command in? Or was it accepting that for the rest of his public life, his first responsibility would always be to support the crown carried by the woman he'd married? Tell me in the comments. And if you watched Elizabeth and Philip during the early decades of the reign, I'd especially like to hear what you remember thinking about him then. Did you see the man behind the Queen? Or did your understanding of Philip change as the years went by? And if you want more royal family stories built from the records instead of recycled gossip, like this video and subscribe. That's what we do here. Not turn people into saints, not turn them into villains. Just go back to what was actually recorded and see what survives. Because there's another part of Philip's story that changes the way all of this looks. Before Elizabeth became queen, there was another man standing between Philip and the future, King George VI. He was Elizabeth's father. The king whose permission mattered before the marriage, the sovereign who made Philip Duke of Edinburgh, the father-in-law who watched the young couple begin married life while Philip was still pursuing the Navy. And then his declining health changed the timetable for both of them. What was the relationship between those two men really like? What did George VI make of the young naval officer asking to marry his elder daughter? And how much did the king's unexpectedly early death alter the life Philip thought he was building? That's the story waiting next. And it begins before Philip ever became the Queen's husband, with the king whose approval he first had to win.